We work in domains of economic, education, and democracy policy. And this is a time, I think, when all those things are very much in question, and so thrilled that we have someone with such wide-ranging experience to help us guide us through this moment. We're here at the dais with our friends at DMZ Sandbox and at TMU, Toronto Metropolitan University, which is on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. And we're committed to honoring our obligations to these nations, treaties, and to Indigenous peoples more generally. And I think we all have our own roles in that effort. I just came from the Prime Minister's Canada-US Economic Summit and had a really great conversation with Natan Obed about the key role of Inuit peoples in this time and what it could mean to positively honor those treaties and arrangements that makes us different, actually, from our other Arctic peers, including those who are eyeing the Arctic map greedily. TMU Forum, Democracy Forum, as you know, is a nonpartisan event series that hosts Canadian leaders from all stripes to talk about the most pressing issues of the day. We're thrilled to have as our partner in this DAIS Senior Fellow, Toronto Star political columnist and host of the TMU Democracy Forum, Martin Regg, and I'll throw it to Martin now.
Thank you. Bienvenue, bonjour. Welcome to our 39th Democracy Forum at Toronto Metropolitan University. We've been busy with democracy this week because we're in the middle of an Ontario election. And we hosted the leaders of the New Democratic Party and the Liberal Party. I think you're familiar with both parties. And
very familiar with both parties.
Today's guest was scheduled before we had this unscheduled snap election. So we're very glad he's here. But he'd be right at home in any election debate because he's been around. He's been everywhere, internationally, nationally, and I never forget, provincially. So let me tell you a little bit more about today's guest, even though you may think that you know him. Bob Rae has been Canada's ambassador to the United Nations since 2020, after serving as the Prime Minister's special envoy on humanitarian and refugee issues, and our envoy investigating the Rohingya in Myanmar. One of the reasons he's such a persuasive diplomat is that he was a very undiplomatic but persuasive politician. Before that, he won election as Ontario's 21st Premier in 1990 after a snap election called by a very popular Premier. He was interim leader of the federal Liberals from 2011 to 2013 before handing it off to Justin Trudeau. And he was elected 11 times to the House of Commons and the Ontario legislature off and on for about 35 years. And I believe, we didn't fact check this, so you can correct me if I'm wrong or just leave it uncorrected, never defeated in his riding.
Correct.
So undefeated in a certain sense.
Yes, yeah. No, in many senses undefeated. As you will discover.
which is unusual in a democracy because it's hard work. He has headed public inquiries, including one on post-secondary education, so you're welcome to ask him his views on tuition and freezing tuition and funding universities. He's also advised Indigenous groups on the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario, which is still ours. I mean, Donald Trump may have his eye on it, but it's still ours for now.
Oh, he does.
It belongs to Indigenous people, actually. He studied modern history at the University of Toronto and got his master's at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, master's in politics. His law degree is from U of T. You can correct me if I get anything wrong. I know you're always fact-checking me, so. He's also a distinguished fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He's a labor lawyer by profession, a politician by disposition, and a diplomat by destiny, like his father before him, who was the ambassador to the United States. He last appeared at our Democracy Forum in 2021, shortly after heading to the United Nations. So welcome back to Toronto Met.
Thank you, Martin. It's great to be here. I think there's a boom on my mic.
Yeah. A little bit, but...
Anyway, go ahead. It makes me sound like a radio announcer. It's good. Hello, Bob Rae here.
You were a vaudevillian, I think, for a moment. So there you are. All right, first some housekeeping. Just a reminder to everyone in the audience that when you signed up for this event, and again when you checked in, you agreed to abide by our code of conduct. Something that I take seriously because I believe in treaties, I believe in trade treaties, I believe in peace treaties, and so when you sign your name to something, you agree to abide by it unless you're Donald Trump. So please abide by that code of conduct today. You get to ask questions, but you got to listen to the answers from our guest. That's how we do democracy here. There are no live microphones except for us with our little boom mics. We're using the Slido app, I believe. Catherine? Yes? No? With the screens are not working, so you can just talk to Viet or Catherine and use your phones to use the QR code. We'll explain that to you. But seriously, do start thinking about your questions, and I think they're being passed out now so that we can use Slido. Just use your phones to log in. I will kick off the questions, then we'll open it up to the audience later, so start thinking it up. I like to remind people every time this is not a news conference, as good as you are at them. It's a democracy forum where we try to dig a little deeper, so it's not a confrontation. We're just looking for more in-depth answers from our guests. Okay, let's get to it. One thing I left out of your biography is that as a teenager, you went to high school in Washington, where your father was ambassador. And now, all these years later, you're living in New York as an ambassador. So you've seen America up close, you've lived there, you grew up there, and you're at home there, it's fair to say. So you turned out okay. Why did things turn out so badly for the Americans?
Wow, that's a provocative question. I think the world is going through a really difficult, challenging time, and America's no different than that. We are too. So I don't single that out one country. And I think the one thing that is important, I'm glad you mentioned it, is that having spent 12 years of my life living in the States. Admittedly, on the East Coast, in Boston and New York and Washington.
And that's the America most Canadians know.
Yes, it is. I'm sort of Eastern liberal establishment, if you like. I don't have an anti-American bone in my body. I really don't. And I think it's important for Canadians to think it through that we do share a lot with the United States. We do share a lot of cultural values. We're intermixed in terms of our people going back and forth across the border, but also families being linked up.
My brother lives for most of his life in the U.S.
There you are. So I'm just saying it's important for us to kind of come to grips with that as Canadians. Going to school in the States meant that I was consciously aware of how Canada was different. Mm-hmm. And I mean, when I was in primary school, we used to have to say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, and I would be the only kid in the class who didn't have his hand on his heart and wasn't pledging allegiance to the flag. And early, the first time I did it, people were saying, "What's wrong with you, Bobby? Like, why aren't you?" And I said, "Because I'm Canadian." And they'd say, "What do you mean?" I said, "I'm not a citizen. I'm not American." And so I've lived this contrast my whole life in terms of seeing it through. I think what we're seeing right now in the United States is really not much different from what we're all going through, and that is a very challenging economic time in the sense that there are some people who have been able to do remarkably well, and the gap between the wealthiest Americans and most other Americans is bigger than it's ever been, or certainly bigger than it's been since maybe the 1890s, before the income tax. So you had huge swaths of wealth, the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts and all those folks, and now we're in a stage where exactly the same thing is happening because of where we're at with digital and where we're at with the huge technological changes that are underway. And I do think that the economic divide is creating a lot of issues in our country, and I think it's creating a lot of issues in the United States. And I think it's also allowing the view that says, well, when that starts to happen, here comes socialism. You sort of say, that's not what's happening. It's a very different revolt that's taking place, a very different group of people who feel that they're extremely separated from society and from the way things are, and are angry and are, expressing that level of anger. I don't think it's a simple answer. This is the subject of many, many, many books, but I don't think any of us should underestimate the resilience and the vibrancy of American society and its capacity to deal with the internal challenges which they're facing.
You raise an interesting point about Canada and America. We had another ambassador here a few months ago, David Cohn, the US ambassador to Canada was. He told us, don't worry, everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
He was dead wrong.
That's what ambassadors say.
Exactly. Right. So don't be so diplomatic.
Be careful. Be careful what
Some of my best friends have been ambassadors.
Yeah.
And Americans. But seriously, are you worried? This is probably not what people came here to hear about, but are you worried about that anti-Americanism that is always so ready in Canada? I remember an NDP leader, Ed Broadbent, who you knew, was also very seized of that, especially in his own party. I'm not kidding when I say because I worked overseas as a journalist, some of my best friends really are Americans, different than the ones who voted for Trump, perhaps. But are you worried about the anti-Americanism that is going to be out of the bottle now and be hard to put back in?
Well, but not just as a Canadian. I think it's a global issue. And it's always been there. It's always been an underlying issue because of the power of the United States and because of some of the things that they have decided to do, and some of them we've done with them, and some of them we haven't. And I think it's important for Canadians to sort of develop a stronger sense of our own history, to say that there's some conflicts where we've been engaged with the Americans, and there's others, global conflicts, and there's others where we decided, no, that's not what we thought was the right thing to do. And that makes our relationship with the Americans always tense. Just today, or yesterday, the president signed an executive order sanctioning the International Criminal Court. Mm-hmm. Canada doesn't agree with that. And we've signaled publicly, together with, I think it's 77 other countries, that we think that's a serious challenge to the rule of law internationally, and it's something we don't think is a good idea. There are over 50 Canadians who work at the court, including a judge who sits on the court. And the executive orders, the details of it, like everything else, are yet to come, because you've got to have more than one day's news on this thing. And so that's an ongoing challenge. There are areas where we have significant differences of opinion. There are areas where we have significant agreements, and sometimes people say shouldn't agree on anything, and I say, well, no. If it's a substantive issue where we do agree, then we should be on board.
But you got to talk to the people you don't agree with. You can't just talk.
Oh, I do that all the time.
And you do that as a diplomat. You do it as a politician.
Yeah.
And you did it on Fox News the other night.
Yes, I did.
I don't subscribe, but I did watch it online. We can role play if you want, in case people.
No.
I can be the Fox News
No,
host.
you don't need to. It's all right.
But you gave as good as you got, but it didn't go over very well. And you were telling me earlier you got a lot of hate mail.
No. You're confusing two different things. It went over great, as far as I was concerned. And as a result, I got a lot of negative fefeedback from the people that you would predict I would get negative feedback.
I've seen him do this before. But one of Mr. Trump's envoys, I think his special envoy in particular, said that you were imploding on TV. So in terms of your audience that you were trying to reach, it's hard to get through. How do you get through?
Well, I think you do get through. What is my audience? I very rarely refuse an interview unless I'm told by the government to not do the interview because they don't want me to do it. And I say, fine. And they've allowed me to do this, by the way. So
I was going to say.
This is high risk, and it's a high wire thing. Yeah, you see, you always look a little negatively at things, Martin. What would you expect somebody everybody who's involved in social media is representing somebody. And is whatever they say, they're doing it for a purpose and for a reason. and because they're trying to undermine the credibility of the other person. That's the problem with social media. That's what makes it such a...
But your appeal was to treat the Prime Minister and the country with dignity.
Yes. And it remains that, and I think a lot of Canadians heard that message, and I think a lot of Canadians appreciated the fact that their representative at the United Nations was saying that on Fox News. And I wouldn't hesitate to go on Fox News again. If somebody said, would you go back? I said, of course.
Yeah, well, Pete Buttigieg does it quite well
Right.
as well.
But I'm sure he gets negative mail as well.
So one can only imagine. So one of the fun things that the host tried to do with you, have fun with you, was to read something you wrote in the Toronto Star back in 2017.
A good paper.
A great newspaper, a great national newspaper, biggest in Canada. And you said in 2017 about Trump, he should not be welcome in our country. And you, of course, pointed out that was you talking as a private citizen, but he is scheduled to come, perhaps, for the G7 in Alberta this year. Should he be welcome, or will he be, not, you can't say that, but will he be welcome, or will he get a terrible reception?
Well, I certainly think he should come. I mean, that's got to be, make that very clear. Again, I don't quite know the context of the piece that I was writing. I think I suspect I was talking about how one needs to take what the president says seriously, and how there's some of the things that he's saying that go beyond what I think is something that Canadians would embrace.
I'm going to be diplomatic about what you said.
Yeah. But
it was a strong piece.
But what I do think is that he's the president of the United States, and if he's coming to an international conference, which you're holding in Canada, he should come here, and he should be welcomed here in that role.
I want to take you back in time to 2021 when you appeared here. Joe Biden had just been elected president of the United States. Donald Trump was in the dustbin of history, as you might say.
I would never say that.
Joe Biden.
If that was true, I would have entered the dustbin in 1995. And life's been pretty good since then, so I wouldn't say that.
Joe Biden was holding democracy summits.
Yeah.
Russia had not yet attacked Ukraine, and you and I were talking about peace in the Middle East, how people shouldn't forget about it just because it was relatively quiet at the time. And then you went to the UN and the world fell apart.
No, I was there when I said that. I was there when
yes,
Biden
that's
was
true.
elected.
You had just arrived. But speaking of history, it does feel like people are forgetting their history. Here's something that you wrote the other day on social media, so it must be true. You said, the UN Charter was drafted in 1945 by people who had learned the lessons that the aggression, isolationism, and tariff barriers of the 20s and 30s had led the world into conflagration. Article 1 makes it clear, threats of annexation are illegal. So are unilateral tariffs in breach of a trade agreement. And today, this morning, a prime minister had a closed-door meeting with a bunch of influencers, as we call them today, union leaders, business leaders, thought leaders. Karim Bardisi was there, and he said that Donald Trump is serious about taking over Canada. He said that this was not in his public remarks. Some journalists found this out. It's in the Toronto Star if you want to look it up right now on your phones. And he said that he wants our minerals, our rare minerals. So what's going to happen?
Well, I think the challenge is that whether it's Canada or Greenland or Panama or Gaza, I would say the president has very expansionist ideas about what the United States should be doing and how it should be doing it. And what I was saying in that tweet, which was something I thought about, saying let's put this in a context, and that is that the generation that created the United Nations had learned the hard way how really dangerous things can happen to world order when everybody thinks about themselves and nobody thinks about the common good, and nobody looks at how can we create stronger ties between countries, how can we improve trade relations, how can we enhance prosperity, how can we do all these things. And I think it's really important for us to remember that and to keep understanding that, and frankly, this has been a driver of Canadian policy ever since 1945. I mean, if you look at our record as a country, we were obviously present at the creation of the United Nations in 1945. We were present at the creation of NATO, which not everybody said that's a great idea, but certainly Canadian governments have consistently
Your
said
friends in the
very
NDP,
important.
and you had a few, were not that fond of NATO or NORAD.
But that's why I think we needed to maintain the position that it is important for us to do that. I think it's also important we were present at the creation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. In fact, there was a Canadian public servant who was one of the main drafters of the treaty. And you just go down this list of the things that we've stood for, and then we go into the Landmines Treaty and the ICC, we go into the drafting of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Again, it was a Canadian who was holding the pen. With Eleanor Roosevelt was chair of the committee, but he was the guy with the pen that was helping to draft it. So when you look at this history that we've had, we're not a superpower.
We're a middle power.
We're a middle power, but we're a middle power that lives next door to a superpower. And as Prime Minister Trudeau Sr. used to say, it's like sleeping with an elephant. And when the elephant rolls over, you feel it. And so that's the challenge that we have. It's the same challenge that we've always had. And it's just that right now, it's ever more serious than it's ever been, because we have not had an American president who had such a nationalist and expansionist view of American power in office in my lifetime. So it's a new ball game as far as that goes. And it's a challenge between those people who say politics is about power, it's not about the rule of law, it's about the rule of men, and it's a knife fight. The world is a knife fight, and you just go into that and you win or lose. Or the Canadian perspective, which is not so much. We do value laws, we do value rules, we do value the relationships that we establish. Not everything is a transaction. Some things are relationships. And there's a real difference between all of these things. And that's, I think, the tension and the difference that we're seeing.
But that's why we supported it, because we didn't have the big knife, and maybe because our Canadian outlook is to have and value relationships. But now you have a president so we're worried about our own fate, but we'll survive. We may not thrive, but we'll survive. But what about the rest of the world? I mean, Trump is cutting foreign aid. He's going to almost certainly cut more funding to the United Nations, which has the World Food Program, the World Health Organization. He's pulling out of that. So that constellation of relationships that you talked about is in such disarray now, not just because of America, but if you think of the Security Council, which governs the UN, China, which we talked about last time, Russia. So how do you do your job? How is your job changing at the UN today compared to how it looked when you took it on 5 years ago?
I don't think it's that much different. I would argue that the challenge, for me, the challenge was very clear after the first while that I was there. The first challenge is really about what I would call where is the public at? Where is public opinion at? In Canada, obviously my first priority, in the United States, and around the world. And I think we make a mistake when we say it's just one person. And that, frankly, it doesn't just oversimplify the situation, it's also inaccurate, because we need to understand that the kind of tensions you talked about in the first question about what's happening to public opinion, if you like, in the United States, is that this is reflected in our own country too. It's reflected in our own opinion. And the first time I really came up against it was in the pandemic, because I went down in the middle of the pandemic, and the first thing as a Canadian representative at the UN you get right away is exactly what you're saying. All the countries of the world. UN is 193 countries, and we're sitting in the General Assembly. And the first 6 months that I was there, I sat there alone because no staff are allowed in. And you can only have one person, you have to be socially distanced wearing a mask. It's an odd way to meet 192 other people, but that's the way it was. And as we were doing so, the question very quickly turned to, what are you doing about COVID? What are you doing about the vaccine? Can you give us some of your vaccine? Can you share your vaccine? Can we make sure that we get vaccinated so that we can deal with the crisis? And I think one of the things that has helped to make life more difficult is that The response of the West to that situation was insufficiently strong, to put it as diplomatically as I can. We did some stuff. We provided support for the institutions in Geneva. We provided funding for the WHO and other institutions. We did something, we didn't do nothing. But we collectively didn't do enough. And we didn't do enough because domestic opinion in Canada was saying, don't you dare send anything out overseas unless it's, I've got mine first. And even after that, they'd say, but even then, I want more. I want my second one.
And that is how democracies work.
That's how democracies work. And that's where I think we have to understand that one of the tensions of democracy, this is a forum on democracy, one of the key tensions on democracy is don't assume that the majority of people are always open-minded, generous, and internationally sensitive in their responses to what's going on in the world. It's not the case. And that's why I think we have to make a much stronger argument with everyone, not speaking down to people and not wagging our fingers at them, but just saying it's actually in our interest to express greater solidarity with the rest of the world. It actually is not a kind of win-lose proposition. It actually is a situation where building up support for a better public good globally actually makes us more secure, actually helps us deal with our problems. And I think increasingly we're having, whether it's, and Your Honor's here, Elizabeth Dowdeswell here, who's been one of the pioneers in environmental strategies in Canada and globally.
Can I interrupt you? Elizabeth Dowdeswell's here, our former Lieutenant Governor.
We're delighted to have her here.
Annoyed at us for giving her a shout out. And that reference was not just to her service in Ontario, but also as the head of the United Nations Environment Program in Nairobi, a very dangerous posting.
Not at all.
Also an advisor to the Democracy
Forum. A great posting. But I just to say on that, take climate change. There is no national answer to climate change on its own. It doesn't exist. We could do everything. We could reduce our emissions to zero tomorrow, and nothing would change in any significant way in terms of the weather and the impacts, the storms, the rising sea levels, all the rest of it. Which is why, frankly, as a political issue, it's actually very difficult to go on the doorstep, which is something that I've done, as you pointed out, 11 times. So it's a lot of door knocking, and you do get to understand what the nature of the democratic conversation is. And most people will say, so what if I do this? Can you promise me that the weather will get better and that I won't have to face these storms and it won't be that? And I have to say, no, I can't promise you that at all. All I can tell you is we won't be able to deal with what is a global, immediate, but also very long-term problem. We have to turn the dial on this question in a very significant way, and it's extremely difficult to do. The world has never made this kind of a change before, led by political leaders. Yes, have we changed how we produce things? Absolutely, but it's not because a bunch of leaders got together in Dusseldorf in 1422 and said, what are we going to do about this printing press? It's pretty exciting, but what are we going to do? It might put a whole lot of churches out of business because people are going to be able to read this stuff for themselves and all the sorts of things are going to happen. It's a very dangerous thing. No, it happens because it's a real technological change. It's a real thing. And that's how climate change happened, because we started to produce energy and started to produce industrial growth, and it took away, it has changed the climate, has changed the way we exist as a planet. So now we armed with science and armed with a certain amount of knowledge, say we do have to do this, and it's damn difficult.
Well, the science is great. The political science is the hard part.
It's the hard part. Yeah. But it's not just the political science in Canada. It's the political science globally. And so there's two things that need to happen to be positive about it. The first thing is we need to understand that most of the countries in the world are not big emitters. They're not. They are takers of climate change, and they suffer from it. And they have real needs in terms of adaptation and how their societies can become more resilient in the face of climate change. That's the first thing. We have to listen to that. And the second thing is, in order for us to convince the newly industrializing countries that we've got to make progress, we have to be part of the answer. Because they're going to look to us right away and say, oh yeah, Canada, here you go, telling us what to do. What are you doing? And we have no credibility with those countries unless we join in the fight together and say it's a mutual fight. We all know we have to do it. It's miraculous that we've been able to sign treaties, but the problem with the treaties is there isn't a single environmental treaty that we've signed on climate change that has an enforcement mechanism built into it.
And we've signed treaties that do have enforcement mechanisms, and they're not very useful right now, are they?
We're not able to use them because the enforcements don't work. And that's one of the central dilemmas of international law at the moment.
Let me ask you about another trend that's taken root in Canada. If you ask Canadians, if you poke them, they'll say, internationally, militarily, we're peacekeepers. That's what we do. We're the peaceniks. But that fashion is changing now. First of all, the peace dividend after the fall of the Berlin Wall seems like a distant memory given what's happened in Ukraine and elsewhere. So did Trump and his predecessors, it's not just him, have a point when they said we were slackers on military spending? And how are we going to address that? How much of that do you take when you're in the U.S.?
Oh, in the U.S., a lot, of course. I mean, everybody, it's an easy target. I do think that, and it wasn't just one party, it wasn't just one prime minister. I think that we all, in the United States, did it as well for a while, and then they came back after President Clinton left office. But
let me refocus the question. Has your thinking changed?
Your question is, no, my thinking has not changed. Okay. I have been a consistent advocate of understanding that defense, development, and diplomacy go together. And I just wrote a piece about this in a book that's just come out this week on security policy. I have been a very consistent, strong concern about security, about its importance to us. That's when I did the Air India report. It was a feature of that report. I served on the Security Intelligence Review Committee for 5 years. I know I've always had a very strong view that you can't let down the side. And frankly, that also includes Canada's defense support for the United Nations, which I hope will show more signs of life.
But spending more on the military is a hard sell in this democracy, isn't it?
I don't think it is. I think you see, the politics is not about counting heads. Politics is about turning heads. It's about convincing people that there's some things that they might not have thought or it might not be their first reaction. But I think if you look now at any assessment I've seen of public opinion, I think more and more people feel that Canada needs to do more, and I think we are doing more. I just read this morning a reminder that Canada's defense spending has increased by 20% last year. So when you look at our security situation in the far north, which means we have to take it seriously. I mean, climate change is completely changing the dynamic in northern development on the water and on land, and together with working with Indigenous communities, we need to make sure that we are playing a strong role in Arctic security, and I think that's why that's become an increasingly important issue for this government, and I think for any government in Canada.
You talked about us being a middle power.
And you did, but I
used the word, but I knew you were going to do that. I opened that up to you. I got to be careful. I really have to watch myself. So Canadian diplomats talk about us being a middle power, and you're one of them. So diplomat, that is. We like to think of ourselves, your prime minister said, I think, and it became a commercial slogan, that the world needs more Canada. I even have the bookmark here. This was in fashion a few years ago. The world needs more Canada. But the world has changed since we started saying that almost a decade ago. And I'm wondering if Canada needs a little less of that Canada Boy Scout spirit in a world where not just Donald Trump is giving us a hard time, but Russia has given us a hard time. China has given us a very hard time. We talked about that the last time you were here. We don't talk about China as much. We're now focused on our friends in America.
I'm happy to talk about China if you want.
We have had trouble with India. We had trouble with Saudi Arabia a few years ago when we were talking to them about human rights, when we talked to the Indians about human rights. So given that that our flank here is exposed with America, are we too focused on a kind of a Jimmy Carter view of human rights is top of mind for Canada, and do we need to look out for ourselves more? Our economic interests, so that we don't become isolated?
Oh, I think our economic, I mean, we have values and we have interests. And that's who we are as people, that's who we are as individuals, and that's who we are as a country. It was a very famous British Prime Minister in the 19th century, Lord Palmerston, who said, we don't have friends, we have interests.
Right.
And that's a kind of blunt imperial view of life. But there is an element of that I think we all have to reflect on and think about. With respect to your point, I wouldn't, I take issue with it a bit, but I'm going to just focus on where I think, where we need to be. It's not about us. It's not about Canada. We can't actually, on our own, we can't actually do really very much at all. We can do a lot by making agreements and reaching out to other countries and reaching across borders and reaching around the world very effectively. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you engage in conversation, by definition, you're having to listen and learn. So you got to do more of that. It's not about that the world needs more Canada. We need the world too, and we also need others to help us do what we think is important. And that, I think, is really where I think our diplomacy and our foreign policy is going, and where it needs to keep going. And that is, it needs to talk about all these things together and try to overcome some of the challenges that we have.
I guess I'm just wondering if we need to be more, it's a global question, so I'm not pinning you down on specifics, but do we need to be a little more hard-headed and pragmatic about protecting those economic interests from retaliation by China, Saudi Arabia, when they pulled out all their medical students suddenly, India, et cetera?
Well, okay, let me just talk. If you want me to talk in general terms, I'd say two things. You always have to think pragmatically. You have to think in terms of your values, but you also, in life, you think about, well, how am I going to do this? And how am I going to get it done? So learning how to be pragmatic is pretty important. And part of that is also learning how to be less impulsive and more consequential in your thinking and in your acting, and thinking carefully about what are the consequences if we do this. And it's really challenging when you have a lot of governments that themselves act very impulsively.
Or politically, in terms of perhaps, all foreign politics is domestic politics sometimes, and we have a lot of diasporas in this country.
We do, but we should take advantage of that in every way we possibly can. And people who say to me, well, people who come to Canada should leave the stuff behind. And I say, well, the British and French didn't do that very well, did they? And so why would you think anybody else would? And so, Canada was born out of a war between two countries that were at war all over the world. And so we were just one of the playgrounds that they had, that they would have these wars.
But you can't pretend that we have the largest Ukrainian diaspora. That perhaps motivated Brian Mulroney to be the first to recognize Ukraine. We have the biggest Tamil diaspora. We have from Sri Lanka. We have the biggest Sikh diaspora.
We joined the First World War because we were part of the British Empire, and we joined the Second World War because we were still part of the British Empire in a way, and because we felt it was our duty to do that. And so all I'm saying to you, Martin, is this is not just now. This is a long-term issue and reality of Canada. But we must also recognize that our relationships with all the countries in the world are really, on balance, greatly strengthened by the fact that the world is in us and we are in the world. And therefore, this is what we are. And so, yeah, every step we take, we have to be aware of this will affect opinion here and there. But you can't let domestic politics drive everything, because then you're ignoring other consequences and the other realities that you face in the world. And I think that's something that every political party has had to learn, and I think it's something we all have to be aware of. I know very well that there are some subjects, when I talk about them, I immediately will get a reaction from both communities in Canada saying, why didn't you say this? Why did you say that? Why did you? And I make a point of sending the same email to everybody and saying, this is where we are as a country. These are the steps we are taking. This is where we need to go. And if it puts me at odds or puts the government at odds with the hard edges of each community, then that's life. But you can't let your politics be driven, your foreign politics, to be driven only by domestic activity, because you lose your perspective on what the global impact is. And my job as an ambassador in the UN is to constantly remind the government that, wait a minute, this is the global impact of this. Let's think it through before we just do the impulsive thing. Because sometimes, particularly with public opinion polling changing every minute, with people, on social media happening every second, it's all like instant reaction. And sometimes you have to say, slow down, please, take the weekend, let's think this through. And I do that to myself quite a lot too. I'm just not a bad thing to think about.
So the advice is put your phone down. I'm looking at my phone because I'm looking at Slido. So I want to just remind folks that, and let's see what we have here. Don't make fun of me for looking. I'm not distracted. Okay, lots of questions. Reminder to use the QR code to sign in if you do want to ask that question. I have one more quick one before I take a tally here, and that is last time I saw you a couple of weeks ago, we talked about Haiti.
Yeah.
A subject that is near and dear to your heart and very close to our country, and there's a diaspora as well. And there is a huge human rights issue that you were very focused on a few years ago before the rest of the world blew up and kind of forgot about Haiti. You mentioned something interesting to me that Marco Rubio is the new Secretary of State in the US, who's doing some interesting things to foreign aid and so on, but he also knows where Haiti is because he's from Miami. Do you have any hope at all that you can engage the United States in a constructive way on Haiti, and any other ideas how to clear up or help on that mess?
Well, on the answer to the first question, absolutely, yes. I do have, in fact, I'm going down to Washington next week for a couple of days to start talking together with a number of my colleagues from other countries. Canada chairs the advisory committee on Haiti to ECOSOC, which I'm also the president of this year. And so we're going down to talk about what's happening. But we're also going to get a lot of briefings from senior officials in the U.S. And it's obviously the new administration is not entirely in place yet. We all understand these transitions take a bit of time. But it's really important that we not lose focus on Haiti, again, because it's in our interest to do so. It's not just an issue about what's happening in one country of 12 million people, it's about what's happening in an entire region where drugs and trafficking of drugs is a big problem, where the trafficking of people is a big problem, and where the insecurity in the region is a challenge. And
I've read that fentanyl is coming from Canada in huge quantities to the United States.
It's not. That's not the issue. But there are other aspects of it's really about what happens with gangs and with the trafficking of arms, as well as drugs and people. That is, when it starts to happen in a region, and when some of the fabric of the region starts to fray, and when gangs are able to play on that in a big way, and when corruption is a problem and an issue, then you have a problem. And we can't just say, well, that if we close the door, we keep people away, that'll solve the problem. No, that's not the answer. You have to figure out how to engage successfully. We have been able to keep our level of engagement high in Haiti, even though it's not always on the headlines, and we will continue to do that. And that's one other aspect of policy that I think is really important, and that is persistence. We tend to come and go. When I say we, I just mean human beings. We tend to come and go because of impulse, because of, oh, that's the shiny object. Oh, what do you? And I keep coming back to this point because I think one of the things about politics that's really happened is that the social media has made deliberate thought very difficult. It means that thinking is short term, reactions are short term. Everybody's tied to their machines. This is that. it's harder and harder to get people, not just kids, not just young people, but older people, to get people to concentrate.
You're on Twitter or X a lot.
With a purpose.
But it's pretty thoughtful. But I will give you a nod, not just on that, but you repurposed your BlackBerry years ago to actually write a book.
Yes, I did.
So would you recommend that? Don't tweet, just write a book on your BlackBerry.
Well, BlackBerrys are not a big item these days. I gather from what
it was the BlackBerry era.
Even I've flipped over to Apple, but.
I'm still on Android.
Yeah, well, I can't help you. But I really think that there's a lot more to this problem than I think we're letting on. Back in the 80s, there was a guy named Neil Postman, who was a sociologist from the States, who wrote a really, I thought, very provocative book about how our attention span is being impacted by infotainment and by the drama of and it was a book about television and the impact of television on politics, which was very insightful. But now this is like multiplied, by algorithms.
If you knew this about impulse control all that many years ago, why didn't you set up Facebook and Instagram and Twitter? You could have been so much richer than you are today. Okay, Suzanne Miller asks, how much can Canada distance itself from the U.S. economically and militarily? And should we seek closer ties with other countries such as Mexico, the UK, and the EU? I suspect your answer to the latter will be yes, but the first part of her question is intriguing. How much can we distance ourselves from a country that we are so close together with?
Well, I think the answer is it's challenging. I think everybody, because of current events, everybody's very aware of the need to create alternatives to the challenge that we face. We've relied not only on American security for our umbrella, we've relied on access to the U.S. market as the basis for our economic growth. And at the very least, we need to understand that we are being told very strongly, we will continue to provide security to us and that will help you, but you got to do more. And I think that's a totally legitimate argument. I don't think that's an illegitimate argument by any, and President Trump is not the first.
No.
I mean, I've heard this on every visit to Washington for a long, long time. So that's one point. And I think people need to be aware of that. But on the economic side, it is challenging to just turn the switch on an economy. You can't do that easily. You have to take the time to figure out what are the other markets, how do you build them, how do we strengthen them. But I do think the one thing that is strong for Canada is a couple of things that I would say. One is we are a highly educated country, and that is partly because of immigration, ironically. It's partly because of the immigrants that have come to the country have tended to be people with a high skill level and high levels of education. But not just that. I mean, there's no comparison. When I went to, and I know this fact from my report that I did for Ontario many years ago, when I went to university in the 60s, 8% of the population of the kids in Ontario, high school leavers, were able to go to university. And that's before the college system was really growing. So now if you take colleges and universities together, we're up close to 50%, which is a dramatic transformation of higher education. It's just a huge change that's taken place, which I think most people would say is amazing. It's great. But you got to keep it up. You got to keep it accessible. You got to keep it working. I think that's a strength for our economy. I think it's a major strength that we have. The second major strength we have is that we're a free trading country. We become a freer trading country. We become open to the possibilities of trade. We sign trade agreements with just about anybody. I'll be stopped in the hall of the UN saying, great, we just signed a trade agreement, and I'll say, oh, that's wonderful. I had no idea, but it's really good that this happened. And so it's making a big difference in our relationships with a whole number of countries who are coming to us and saying, we want to join this, we want to be part of it. And that's where I think our psychology is really quite different from the psychology of people say. And it's not because we're better than anybody else, it's because don't forget, we rely on trade for over half of our GDP. And over 70% of our trade is with the United States. Okay. And in some parts of the country, it's even higher than that. So just do the math that our GDP would be nowhere near where it is if we didn't trade. The United States is much less reliant on trade than we are. Germany is much less reliant on, there's many countries that are much less reliant on trade.
They have the home market.
They have the home market, and we don't have as big a home market as we need to have.
You opened the door to a question on tuition. Our premier in this province, 7 years ago, one of his first acts was to cut tuition by 10%. I'm asking because, as he pointed out, he co-chaired or chaired a commission with Bill Davis, I believe, on education and university post-secondary education in Toronto for the Dalton McGuinty government. So Doug Ford cut tuition by 10%. He's a populist, you may have heard. And he has frozen it ever since, 7, 8 years. And so universities and colleges are starving for cash flow. And and we had 2 politicians here this week saying that they also would not raise tuition. Doug Ford didn't make the universities whole. They say they would. What's your thought about the tuition conundrum?
I haven't changed my mind since 2005 when I wrote the report. I was actually asked by Dalton McGuinty to do this report because he had made a promise to freeze tuition when he ran. And I don't think I'm giving any secrets away when I say that what he then said to me was, can you help me with this? Because I said to him at the time, I said, you're really going to regret that commitment because it doesn't work. And I don't believe it works. What I think does work is you really need to sustain and support the universities. And you really need to see it as a long-term investment for society. And I deeply regret that we do not have enough of a championing of higher education, colleges and universities, research and development, graduate studies, the whole schmear. That's such a critical area of our society. We also need to do more to ensure that we are targeting our financial assistance for students in such a way that it really gets the help they need to the lowest income students. My problem with freezing a blanket freeze, and no political party will agree with me. I mean, I accept that.
We've asked them all.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's fine. I'm just saying to them, if you persist in doing this, you will end up with a constantly challenged and less than magnificent post-secondary system, and we can have that system. We're so close to having that system if we can just get the numbers and contributions right. We have always relied on tuition and on private support, philanthropic support, and we've relied on government funding. And government funding as a share of that package has consistently gone down, except for when the McGuinty government agreed with my recommendations, and it led to the single largest increase in support for higher education that the province has ever seen in 2 years after the report. Unfortunately, it was not maintained. And then governments got into, oh, let's fiddle with the tuition thing. And you say, you know, the trouble with tuition is that there are many students who can afford it, and there's some who can't, and families. And so you need to target your support to those families that can't support it and make sure that, in effect, it's a net zero for many, many thousands of students. And that's the way it should be. And I don't know, it's a tough thing to convince people, but education it's not only, it's an investment in yourself. And so don't think that there isn't a significant advantage to students from having an education, and don't forget that a large part of the population doesn't have the same access that you do. So it's not unreasonable to say you should contribute something. Now, there is an argument that I think more people are looking at and saying, well, if we're approaching universality or closer to universality in access to higher education, let's make it the same way. We don't charge people to go to high school. We don't charge people to go to primary school. You say, fine, but you got to then you got to fund it. You got to fund it in a proper way. And universities and colleges are stuck in the middle of this political debate.
Without a constituency to advocate.
Well, they have a constituency, and another story, but I mean, they do have a big constituency. We just don't go after them. We don't really embrace this learning culture as the heart and lifeblood of our economy and of our life as a country and as a province. And we really should be doing that.
Here's a question from Shervin. Many students are interested in world politics and want to get involved. What do you think? How can you support extracurriculars like the Model United Nations or TMU's Model UN?
Well, I speak at these institutions all the time. I do it virtually and I do it in person. I'm speaking at I'm almost embarrassed to say this. I'm speaking at the U of T event on Sunday because I was invited. And so I'm glad to do that. I'm very happy to be there. There is a real hunger, I find, with students around the country. I spoke last week, in fact, my colleagues are sort of saying, when are you going to be in New York? I said, well, I was in Quebec and in Laval last week, 2 weeks ago, and in Winnipeg at the Human Rights Museum. And there's a huge appetite in the country for international issues, huge appetite, huge level of interest, and that's shared by younger people. And I think when it comes to, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, which Liz would very much want me to talk about, and I do want to talk about them. I'm going to be going to an event tonight to talk about them. They really are the common sense of humanity. We don't want people living in poverty. We don't want people living in hunger. We want people to have access to education. We understand that climate change is a global issue and needs a response from everybody. We believe in peace and security. We know it requires global investment. These are not abstract things that are invented by people in New York or in other capitals around the world. They're very much in the national interest of our country to embrace them and to be part of them. And I'm proud that Prime Minister Trudeau accepted the invitation from the Secretary General to be a champion of the SDGs, and we must continue to do that. I think there's a tremendous interest globally in these issues, and there's one other thing I'd like to see governments do, both provincially and federally, and that is provide more opportunities for students in the years after university to do some international service and to engage globally and to be able to do that much more effectively. Intern programs, other ways, paid, not just volunteer, but paid programs. I think we need to deal with that because one of the most challenging times that students face, I say this to any students in the audience, it's not when you're here, it's when you leave here, because it's the gap between here and, quote, the real world, as we say. And that's where I think we need to be more creative in how we can facilitate that. I get emails, I get people, because I'm on social media, it's not hard to find me, Somebody can send me a message. And my staff are very aggravated because they say, you answered these things. I said, yeah, I try to. It's hard.
You can give out your cell phone number like Doug Ford.
No. I'm not going to do that. But believe me, anybody wants to find me, you can find me without any difficulty. But it's challenging.
Can I ask you, before we run out of time, I'm going to circle back to questions in a minute. We'll go into a bit of overtime with your permission, and that is to talk a little bit about this place, Ontario.
Yes.
So this 1990 election, you remember it?
I do.
Snap election.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about the perils of snap early elections by premiers who are very high in the public opinion polls?
Well, first of all, I will not answer questions or deal with anything to do with current politics in Ontario. I won't do that at all.
We're talking history here.
No, we're talking history. Well, it's interesting because, when Mr. Peterson, just to remind everybody for whom these years are either non-existent or else a kind of haze, 85, the Conservatives were defeated for the first time in 42 years. Mr. Peterson became the premier, because the NDP signed an accord with him to form a government, and he did, with conditions attached, which by and large he lived up to. And looking back on it now, I realize the reason he lived up to it is because we had money. The money was flowing after the recession of 81. There was a lot of revenue flowing between 81 and 89. And then 87, he called an election after the accord was over and won a huge majority. And when it came back, I said to my team and to the caucus, and we were chatting about it, said, we have to be prepared for an election after 3 years. And they said, why? I said, because he's got a big majority and he's going to want to pick a moment when he thinks he can keep that or close to it and won't lose too much.
Lock it in.
Because under our system, the first past the post system, the number of seats you have grossly exaggerates your actual level of support in the population. So we had, what, I can't remember the number of seats, 93 seats or something? Had a lot of seats. And we had hardly any. So that it was a vast, huge mass of liberals, provincial liberals behind Mr. Peterson, and we were like 19 to 16, I think, the two opposition parties. So, so we started just getting ready. And look,
What's the risk that Peterson took?
the risk was that people wouldn't realize that he was calling it early because the economy was turning south very fast. And what I think he didn't realize that there was almost a perfect storm of economic shifting, which is sort of like, the weather. All of a sudden you feel, that there's a day in August when you sort of say, not summer anymore. You wake up in the morning, it's cold and it's crisp. And there's that kind of shift in the wind, and we have a cottage, and you can see the wind's coming from the north. You say, the wind is changing. And I'll say this to my grandkids. They said, Papa, it's nice, it's summer. Like, what are you talking about? I said, no, it's not. And the same thing happened to Mr. Peterson. He was ahead, the first day of the election, he was ahead in the polls by 25 points. And I can remember campaigning. I did something which, first of all, I said to Arlene, before the election, I said, this is the last election,
yes,
and we're going to go out with a bang and have fun and enjoy. I'm going to be more relaxed because I was quite tense and edgy in many ways. And so I got to learn how to kind of just go with the flow. And first day the election was called, we went out from Queen's Park and did something which you're never supposed to do. And that it was an unscripted visit to Kensington Market. And there were no beaters, not like beaters we call. People go out and say, Bob Rae's coming, and they said, I don't want to see that man ever, ever. Say, okay, we won't stop at your store, it's okay. We didn't have that, we didn't do that. So we just walked down the street.
You were flying blind.
Yeah, flying blind, it was crazy. And everybody was very nervous. And we got amazing response. And I said, that's fantastic, it's terrific, it's just great. And the next day we saw the overnights, and I was still 25 points behind. And they said, well, But within about a week or two, you could feel it. You could just feel the change. Crowds started to grow. People started turning up. There are ways you know how you're doing. In the old politics, much less scripted than today. If you couldn't fill a hall, you knew you were going south.
It was pretty scripted even then. Quick question.
But less so.
Quick question about history. When you're driving on the Highway 407 toll road,
yes.
What are your thoughts about then? And because some people are saying, let's take the tolls off, but you can't comment on that. But what do you think about the highway that you built?
I'm very proud that we were able to build the largest infrastructure project in the Commonwealth at the time. It was a big project, and very proud that we were able to get it off the ground and get it going. True story. I am a believer in tolls. Road pricing.
So am I.
And road pricing is something that if I hadn't traveled so much as a kid, because my dad was a diplomat, and hadn't traveled in opposition, I wouldn't have seen that, the Singapore is doing it, that Hong Kong is doing it, they're doing it around the world. Why don't we embrace this idea? It's a good concept. And the caucus was not thrilled with these thoughts. And I said, well, what if we build a new road with a toll? Okay, we got it going, we got it up. And it's been a huge success. In fact, it's a big joke in the family because when I came home one day when I was premier, Arlene and the kids had put a piece of string across the stairs with a little box there saying, "You want to go upstairs, Dad? You got to put money. You got to put money in."
A price signal.
Family secret. She was not a fan of tolls. She thought this is all. like not a good idea. And so, I mean, I think the big, and I'll just say this because it's not current politics, I think Mike Harris is, well, I think the decision to basically pour concrete down the subway, the Eglinton subway, was a disaster. It was a truly stupid decision, and now we still haven't finished the Eglinton subway. For those of you who don't know, it was started in 1992, and it was ready. It was like we got the machinery going, and it was being built, and he stopped it. Like, didn't just stop it, but he prevented anybody else from doing it. So the process of rebuilding it has proven to be
booby-trapped it.
Yeah, exactly. So, but that's important. But the decision to sell the 407 in order to meet a short-term target of being able to go into an election saying, hey, you know that huge deficit that Bob Rae had?
It's gone.
It's gone. It's a miracle. You know, it's just like, and I said, boy, is that ever a dumb decision? I mean, it's just so short-term, and it ended up you lose control of the pricing, and you lose the control of the benefit of it, and you can't use the pricing to advance, to drive traffic in various ways, to get it from one part to the other, and that's all I'll say about that. That was
I'll tell you a secret. Doug Ford is running huge deficits, but nobody talks about it.
Nobody talks about it.
Let's not talk about it. 'Cause that's
I know.
present day politics.
Believe me, I'm now an expert in global deficits. I'll tell you about.
Okay,
I know a lot about that.
I have a serious question for you, and that is
That was a serious question.
Last time you were here, the Middle East was quiet and also stalemated, and you and I talked a lot about the underlying tensions that were bound to explode, and they did. You had a front row seat at the United Nations when Hamas attacked on October 7th, and so you saw the polarization among members, those 192 members at the UN. You know about the polarization here at home. The UN hasn't been very helpful, though, in the Middle East over the years. Going back to Suez, it was, maybe a bit in 67, 73, but that's a long time ago. Now, ever since it's been Camp David, it's been Oslo, it's been Qatar. And so my question to you is, tell me that you weren't demoralized by all the bloodshed on the one hand and the bloodlust and the bad blood that we're seeing all around us, but particularly at the UN. So did the Middle East blow up the UN as well?
No, it didn't blow up the UN, but it is a tragedy. And the thing, first of all, just to focus on the UN for a minute, the UN is only as strong as the membership allows it to be, and the UN is stymied by the fact that there's 5 countries that have a veto in the Security Council. So every issue affecting peace and security is affected by the veto. And that's why many disputes happen outside New York and outside the immediate frame of the UN, although don't forget the incredible work that the UN does in every region of the world. We have resident coordinators, we have people working on the ground, we have people involved in peace negotiations that nobody knows about, we have people involved in discussions that nobody knows about, a huge amount that's done on prevention. So it's important to kind of have that sense of background to it. But on the Middle East, you know, when you say have I been demoralized? I wouldn't use the word demoralized. I would say I'm deeply saddened, deeply, profoundly saddened by and outraged by what I see. I think the initial attack by Hamas was as brutal a thing as you can imagine in such a short, shock time for Israel, for Israelis, for the Israeli public, but for the world. And then immediately the response, which was very, very destructive of the entire infrastructure of Gaza. And now we can see it, right? We now know what all of our people were telling us was the case in Gaza. We've had lots of information about what's happened. The number of people killed is, I think, higher than the estimates that we've seen. People have been made homeless. The place is completely obliterated. And every report that I've seen from people going into Gaza, and all of the information that we have is that it's a profoundly difficult and tragic situation, which it is.
Setting aside Mr. Trump's distractions about Gaza,
Good.
What can be done
Well,
on the Middle East peace process, or is it set back even further?
No, I don't think we know that yet. I think we only know that everybody's playing a very dangerous game. We have a ceasefire agreement, which only covers a short period of time, in which hostages are supposed to be exchanged for prisoners, and in which there's supposed to be no fighting in Gaza. But there's a second phase that's necessary, because at some point that ends. Under that timetable, you would still have hostages being held by Hamas, and you would still have many prisoners in Israel. So you need to say, well, the next phase has to go. But the next phase is not only about exchange; it also is supposed to be about decisions around the rebuild of Gaza. And I think I have to say, I've said it yesterday on a number of news networks. I'll just say it again. You cannot have any kind of progress on Gaza without the support of the Palestinian people. Mm-hmm. We have to begin to turn towards the process of creating political agency for the Palestinians, which we've moved away from. On all my visits to the Middle East over the last 30, 40 years, I've always been struck by the fact that many of the Israeli leaders would say, don't worry, we're managing this. We're going to manage this conflict. And I said, you can only manage it for so long. And I've also said many times, I'm saying it again today, is the Jewish community in Israel knew that it wanted to be a country, and knew that it wanted to be a nation, and knew that it wanted political agency. And if you'd said to them, oh, well, we'll manage your problem, I mean, it wouldn't have worked. So why would we think it'll work for the Palestinians? It won't work.
You don't sound optimistic at all
No, I am.
about the peace process.
I actually am. I am. The reason that I'm optimistic is because, optimistic is I'm determined. Let's put it that way. We have to be determined to get to the second phase of the ceasefire agreement, and then to build that to the third, which is talking directly about the political conditions that need to change to create self-determination for the Palestinian people, and that has to move. It's proving very difficult because there are so many competing things, but there are some strong positive things that we need to talk about. One of them is the countries in the region are very interested in finding a path to stability. Syria is not where it was before. We need to work through with all of the neighboring countries and talk about how can we create a basis for greater stability. Everybody, I think, is agreeing. The Arab states are meeting in Egypt apparently over the next week or two to come up with their sense of what the plan should be, and everybody is has to engage in this discussion. We have to engage in the discussion to say, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to move? How do we move it forward? And it has to be based on certain key principles. One is the Israelis have to be assured that they're going to be living in security, and that I think is the underlying angst of the Israeli public, and that's where public opinion is. But we need to understand that if people can't get diverted by that issue into thinking that there's an ongoing military answer. There is a need for security, yes, but there also has to be a need for a political solution, which includes two states.
Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, one more.
We've got him on the spot here.
No, you don't.
It's a question from the floor, and I thought it was an intriguing one, having listened to you for the last more than 60 minutes now. How does a regular person become an effective and captivating public speaker? Sounds like a tough question.
Well, the first thing is practice, and I've had the benefit of a lot of practice. And I think that
you were good at the beginning, if I may say so.
Listening is good. Learning how to listen and read an audience and see. I mean, if you're any good as a speaker, you can read disinterest, boredom. The final thing is something that I think is absolutely critical. And that is to understand that there's a difference between the written word and the spoken word. Just about all of us are in politics today, all of us are told, have you got the speech? And I have a former speechwriter here, Alex is there. Have you got the speech? You say, well, eventually all my speechwriters say, it's really sort of like Peter Mosher, who was one of my earliest speechwriters, says it's sort of like being a bodyguard for Sonny Liston. You don't actually need a bodyguard. You don't need a speechwriter. And everybody does in a way. Now, so the way you speak has to reflect your ability to embrace spontaneity and also failure. So it's like stand-up comedy. You can tell a joke and nobody laughs, or you can tell a joke and everybody's appalled. How could you say that? And all of the flubs and things that we do when we're in public are the price of being real. You want me real? Otherwise, I just looked at my script, and you can see it in debates, by the way. When you look at the political debates, many of them carry notes with them, and also just because they're looking up doesn't mean they're looking at you, they're looking at the teleprompter. And that, there is an immediate difference between the two. And in order to practice, the book that influenced me the most as a kid, my father gave me this, and my dad was trying to slow me down, like slow down. And he gave me a book by a well-known American lawyer in the 50s. His name was Louis Nizer, who was a well-known defense lawyer in New York City. And Louis Nizer wrote a book called Thinking on Your Feet. And Louis Nizer just made this point, say, okay, if I'm reading speech, what do you see? What do you see?
Reading.
No, what do you see? Audience, anybody? My forehead, my hair. Yeah, you don't see my eyes. It's pretty hard to convince anybody when you can't see their eyes. And he was talking not only about giving speeches, but also about courtroom experiences. And it's especially true in court when you have to look at people and figure out there's got to be other means of communicating. So whether it's a judge or 3 judges or 5 judges or whether it's a witness, and I'm a lawyer. So when you do that, you learn that you've got to look at the response. And the same thing's true in politics. You knock on the door, somebody comes to the door. What's the first thing you do? Eye contact. Eye contact, eye contact. And that is so important. And when I started out, somebody came up to me and said, you don't always look at me when you talk. And I don't. And some people find that disconcerting, and they'll look at where is he looking? Like you'll turn around and say, what's he looking at? Why isn't he looking at me? And it's not, I don't say that as a sign of, that's really good. It's not good because I look away sometimes, and it's because I'm gathering my thoughts and trying to think about what I'm going to say. But I can't stress enough the importance of speaking is an extension of engagement. Speaking is like acting. It's like being in the moment. It's like being prepared to inspire and being prepared to make people laugh, to make people cry. And it's about emotions. It's not only about rational writing things down, which is why governments and bureaucrats and officials don't like it, because they want to know what you're going to say. They're going to want to know what you just said, and they're going to need to know what, how can I tell people what the premier said or what the ambassador just said. And that's where you have to learn that really good communication depends on both. Depends on the written word and the spoken word. It's not that writing is not important. Writing is a very important form of communication. And learning how to write well is important, and you know that. You do that.
Writing well?
You're writing well. Writing very well.
So
it's not because I'm opposed to writing that I think that, that's a...
I'm going to put down my script and just use the teleprompter right now while maintaining eye contact with my guests. And I want to thank our UN ambassador very much for coming here. I also want to thank the audience for being so democratic And I want to remind you that we're going to have the Green Party leader, Mike Schreiner, at our Democracy Forum next week, although you really gave it all away with your talk on climate change, so we can just replay an excerpt of what you said about you and Ms. Dowd as well. But thank you all for coming. Merci, Megwetch and Kareem. Over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Ambassador, for... Thank you for sharing a lifetime of experience in this moment when we need leadership. So really deeply, greatly appreciated. On behalf of the dais, I want to thank Brian, the TMU Media Services Lead, TMU Security. This has been our third Democracy Forum of the week. And so this is delivered with Martin on stage, and sometimes you see me, but there's a mighty dais team that delivers, led by Catherine Ambergi, our events lead. Catherine? Thank you, Catherine. And, I see a few three-time champions here who came to all three Democracy Forums or Fora, so thank you for coming. Mariana Rodriguez behind the lens, Nina Rafiq Dow, Claire Raymond, Vivian Lee, Mariam Hamid, Tiffany Kwok, Sanjana Shah, Tanya Coyle, Andre Cote, and Viet Vu have all been putting this on together today as well. Also, in the name of democracy, we are co-hosting Democracy Exchange, Canada's Democracy Summit, on April 3rd to 5th. Get your tickets at democracyexchange.org. Thanks to Your Honor, Elizabeth Dye as well, who's also on our advisory board. And thanks to all of you for joining in this democratic exercise today.